I was still holding my spoon when my heart cracked. The soup had gone cold. I hadn't touched it since it was served, too salty, too heavy for my stomach lately. But I stirred it anyway. Out of habit. Out of politeness. That's the thing about being old. People expect you to be invisible, but still grateful. Across the table, Kayla was giggling over her phone, her fork tapping rhythmically against her plate. Darren had his earbuds in. Diane, my daughter-in-law, sipped her wine with that smirking kind of detachment she always wore during family dinners. It was supposed to be just a nice Wednesday evening. Then it happened. Diane leaned into my son, Paul, and whispered something low, quiet. But not quiet enough. No one wants a sick grandma hanging around forever. I froze. My eyes didn't even blink, but my grip on the spoon tightened, a tremor starting in my knuckles. I didn't look up. I just kept stirring a soup I didn't want, in a house that no longer felt like mine. Paul didn't respond. He just chewed slower, eyes avoiding mine. There it was, the unspoken truth, now finally spoken. I was the ghost in the guest room, the ticking clock they pretended not to hear. I didn't confront them. That wasn't how I was raised. My mother used to say, "Dignity is what you do with silence." So I swallowed the salt in my throat and the ache in my chest. Dessert came and went. I smiled at the pie, complimented Kayla on her latest college essay, and even offered to help clear the plates. No, you just sit," Diane said sweetly, already stacking dishes before I could rise. The same hands that had passed me a birthday card last week were now sweeping me to the edges of usefulness. In the kitchen, I heard her mutter to Paul, "She's starting to forget things again. We should really talk to Dr. Maxwell about assisted living options." Another whisper, not meant to reach me, but I heard. I heard it all. That night, I sat in the rocker by the window in the room they call the guest room. But it's my room. It's the one I sleep in, think in, breathe in. It holds the quilt I stitched with Paul's name on it when he was 6, and the old wooden jewelry box James gave me on our 15th anniversary. I opened it, touching each piece slowly. My wedding ring, a silver chain, a locket with my mother's photo. My hands didn't tremble then. They were steady, practiced. I was remembering who I was before I became grandma, or the sick one, or an inconvenience. The next morning, I woke early, as I always do. The house was still dark. I made tea in silence. The kettle didn't whistle. I turned it off before it. I watched the sun break over the fence. While Diane and Paul still slept, I imagined them in bed, talking in hushes about paperwork, what to do with Mom, maybe even Googling power of attorney. They'd started calling my insurance company last month, on my behalf. Diane said it was for convenience. I knew better. Later that day, I saw it in Paul's browser when he asked me to check the weather, how to transfer assets from elderly parent. I stared at the tab for 5 full seconds before pretending not to notice. "Oh, looks like rain this weekend," I said, and smiled. The shift was quiet but complete. Paul had been a kind child once. He used to sleep curled next to me on the couch during storms. After James died, we lived on my sewing and Social Security for 2 years. He never went without. I worked nights at the church office and saved every cent. That money helped him get through med school, helped them buy this house. My name's not on the deed. It didn't need to be. I trusted him. I still remembered the words he whispered when they moved me in after my hip surgery. "This is your home now. Always." But always, it turns out, has an expiration date. That afternoon, I opened the locked drawer in the old armoire I'd brought with me from my last apartment. Inside was the fireproof pouch, with all the documents, my savings account, the life insurance payout from James, and the small but tidy investment I'd managed through a friend's brokerage. They didn't know. They assumed I had a pension and a few coins in a pill bottle. They didn't know that the sick grandma had been quietly preserving a fortune, enough to buy a house, enough to disappear, enough to make a statement. After dinner that night, they were all watching TV. Some reality show. Kayla laughed too loud. Diane was texting. Paul looked bored. I walked to the back porch without a word and sat on the wooden bench. James and I built the year Paul turned 10. The wind was light. The scent of jasmine still lingered in the air from the garden I tended every spring. "No one wants a sick grandma." They'd said it like it was a fact, a throwaway line. But in that moment, I knew exactly what I would do. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Tomorrow, I would go for a walk, but not just any walk. I'd walk past the park, past the pharmacy, to a place where someone once told me, "You're not forgotten." A stranger, yes, but a kind one. Someone who didn't flinch when I asked for help lifting a grocery bag. Someone who didn't recoil when I mentioned James, or when I coughed. Someone who had once said, "If I had a grandmother, I'd want her to be like you." I smiled to myself, my hand brushing the quilt draped beside me. Let them keep whispering. Let them plan. I'd already begun mine. The morning air had a brittle kind of chill to it, the kind that wakes you fully, not gently. I stepped out, just after sunrise, floral blouse, buttoned tight against the wind, the zipper of my cardigan stuck halfway up. I didn't bother with makeup, only swiped on a faint touch of lipstick, more for memory than vanity. The house behind me was still, blinds drawn, the kitchen light off. They were still asleep. I didn't leave a note. What was I supposed to write? Gone for a walk. Back. Never. I walked slowly, at first, letting my legs find their rhythm, careful with the uneven pavement near the post boxes. My hips still ached in the mornings, but pain has a different flavor when your mind is made up. The street curved toward the main road. The bakery on the corner hadn't opened yet, but the scent of last night's dough clung to the alley like a memory. Past the pharmacy, the sidewalk widened. That's where I saw the mural, a painted tree with 100 names etched like initials in the bark. I paused. One of the names, Eleanor R., was mine. I remembered the day I'd helped paint it, 10 years ago now, with the local outreach program. Paul had teased me about it. "Street art now, Mom," he'd said, and I'd laughed, not knowing that someday I'd cling to that wall, like a witness. 2 more blocks, then a right onto Wilcox. That's where the building stood, peeling gray paint, blue awning with Linden Care Agency, barely legible from sunfade. It looked like the kind of place no one cared to enter. But I did. Inside, the bell above the door jingled, and a young man behind a cluttered desk looked up with a start. "Mrs. Raines?" he asked, blinking. "You came back." I smiled faintly. "You remembered me?" He stood and extended a hand. "Of course. I'm Eli." He had kind eyes, unrushed. He'd been the one I met in the grocery lot 2 months ago, helping his mother into a van, her oxygen tank trailing behind her like a secret. I'd helped adjust her coat. He'd said thank you like he meant it. "Would you like to sit?" he offered. I nodded and eased into the fabric chair across from his desk. "I have a question," I said, pulling the zipper on my handbag. "And a proposition." He listened without interrupting as I explained. "Not everything. But I'm not dying," I said. "Not that they know of. But I am disappearing, and I need someone I trust to help me make it official." He tilted his head. "Disappearing how?" "I have assets," I said carefully. "Not enormous, but enough to change someone's life. I don't want them to go to the people who see me as a burden. They think they've won, that I'm slow and tired and won't notice the way they're maneuvering. But I do." He leaned forward slightly. "And you want to give them away?" I nodded once. "To someone who remembers I'm still a person." He looked stunned, but not greedy. That was important. There was no flicker in his eyes, no calculation, just a quiet kind of alarm, like he was standing at the edge of something he hadn't expected to be invited into. "I'm not asking for anything in return," I said, "except that you don't erase me, that you remember I mattered to someone." He swallowed, and for a moment the room felt unbearably still. Then he said, "I think that's the most generous thing anyone's ever said to me." We spent the next hour talking, not about money, but about people. His mother had been a school teacher. He worked 2 jobs to keep her meds stocked. They lived in a converted garage behind a friend's house. No air conditioning, but she liked to garden. He told me she used to call him my compass when her memory started to falter. "You're lucky," I said quietly. He nodded. "I know." Then I pulled out the ledger, not a spreadsheet or some high-tech folder, but a real, handwritten ledger. It had thick pages and ink stains, and it listed every deposit, every account, every bond and certificate under my name. I handed it to him. His fingers hesitated before accepting it. "Don't lose it," I said. "It's all in there." "I won't. I'll handle the lawyer," I added. "But if anything ever happens to me, If they try to put me away or say I'm not of sound mind, this proves I knew what I was doing." Eli nodded, more solemn now. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Are you scared?" he asked. I paused. "No, but I'm grieving. For a son who used to hold my hand in the car. For a family that now speaks in whispers. For the way they stopped seeing me." He nodded again. "You don't have to explain. I see you." We agreed to meet again next week, just once more, to finalize things. No paper trails yet, not until I had secured my will's revision through an attorney I trusted, not until I'd moved my documents out of that house. Back on the sidewalk, the wind had picked up. It pushed against me like a child needing attention. I pulled my collar tight and kept walking. When I reached the corner of Oak Ridge, I looked up just in time to see Paul's car pass by on the far side of the intersection. He didn't see me, or maybe he did, and chose not to stop. Funny how after years of raising someone, they can still feel like strangers behind glass. By the time I returned home, the house was full of noise. Kayla was arguing with Diane about laundry. The dog was barking at the neighbor's cat. Paul was on a call. No one noticed me slip in. I went straight to my room, locked the door, and pulled out a suitcase. Not to run. Not yet. Just to start. The next morning began like any other. Diane knocked once before cracking open my door. "We're doing brunch with the Millers," she said, her tone just polite enough to be rehearsed. "You need anything before we head out?" I smiled from the edge of the bed. "No, thank you." She didn't wait for more. The door clicked shut before the smile could fall from my face. I waited until their car had reversed out of the driveway before I moved. I didn't need much time. I'd already packed the important things: my ID, the notarized life documents, the titles, the folder from the safe that James once labeled in bold ink, "Survival." I tucked them all inside my brown leather tote and pressed a folded cardigan on top, just in case anyone peered in. The house was silent. I moved slowly, not because I was tired, but because speed makes noise. I checked the living room, empty. The laundry room, empty. Then I opened the hallway closet. It looked like any other cluttered family storage. Puzzles missing pieces, broken umbrella handles, Kayla's forgotten rollerblades, but at the very back, behind a plastic bin of unused Christmas lights, was the box I needed. A plain, nondescript shoebox. Inside, 35 years of personal letters, mostly from James, and a few from Paul, back when he still called me Mama in his handwriting. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. Some things are already printed on the back of your eyelids. I placed the shoebox in my suitcase, not because it was valuable to them, but because it reminded me I'd once been adored. Back in my room, I removed the framed photograph of James and me from the nightstand. It was the only picture still visible. All the others had gradually disappeared from the walls, packed up during the last repainting to modernize the space. That morning, I was deliberate. I changed into my best slacks, the navy pair I'd bought 2 years ago for a funeral I didn't end up attending. I buttoned my floral blouse all the way to the collar, not because it was cold, but because it made me feel held together. I looked in the mirror. My reflection met me with calm. Ice blue eyes, faint lipstick, still me. I left the suitcase by the door and walked to the kitchen. I pulled a notepad from the drawer next to the fridge, one of those grocery list pads with magnets on the back. I wrote a single sentence. "You were right. No one wants a sick grandma." I folded it once and left it on the table beneath the salt shaker, where they'd have to lift it to season their food. The walk to the bus stop was uneventful. A neighbor waved. I waved back. She didn't notice the suitcase wheels dragging behind me. Most people don't look for exits until after someone's gone. At the stop, a young man offered me his seat on the bench. "No need," I said. "I've been standing my whole life." The ride downtown took 40 minutes. I sat by the window, watching storefronts slide past. Antique shops, empty barber chairs, murals half-worn by weather and time. I thought of the house, of Diane's sharp perfume, of Paul's tightening jaw when bills were discussed. I thought of how they rearranged the pantry and removed my favorite cereal without ever asking. "You don't need that much sugar at your age," Diane had said once. I thought of all the little things they'd taken from me, without technically stealing. When I arrived at Eli's office, he was standing by the window, watering a single plant in a chipped ceramic pot. He looked up, surprised. I wasn't expecting you today. I set the suitcase down. I know, but I'm done preparing. He gestured toward the chair. You sure? Yes. We sat. He poured tea from an electric kettle he kept on a side table. It wasn't mint or chamomile. Just black tea, strong, straightforward. I've arranged everything with my lawyer, I said. There's a backup file in a lockbox at my new place. You'll have access once the documents go through. I've also updated my will. Eli blinked, then nodded. You're brave, he said. No, I replied. I'm just finished being erased. He handed me a form, something to confirm future medical preferences. I signed it without hesitation. It felt like reclaiming the pen after years of watching others write my story. I can help you settle in if you need help moving, Eli offered gently. No need, I said. It's a small room, but it's mine. No one will ask why I'm still alive in it. He smiled, not with pity, but with something that looked suspiciously like admiration. I never asked, he said, but why me? I looked at him a long time before answering. Because when you looked at me, you didn't see an expiration date. Back at my new place, Unit 12 of a quiet converted boarding house, I unpacked slowly. The bed was simple, the curtains thin, the windows opened onto an alley. But there were no passive-aggressive sighs, no subtle rearrangements of my belongings. No one muttered about space. I set the photo of James on the narrow dresser. He fit perfectly. I placed the shoebox on the bottom shelf of the nightstand, beneath a worn paperback and a half-filled crossword book. I opened the window, let in the late afternoon air. I brewed another cup of tea, sat in the single wooden chair by the desk, looked at the empty wall, and imagined what I might hang there. Maybe I'd paint again. I hadn't touched a brush since Paul was in middle school. Maybe I'd write a letter to no one, just to hear my own words again. Maybe I'd just sit in the quiet, because it was mine. 3 days passed before they noticed I was gone. I expected it to be sooner, maybe the moment Diane found the folded note under the salt shaker. But silence can be a powerful sedative. It lets people believe absence is temporary, that it's a phase or a tantrum, not a decision. I didn't check my phone until the third morning in the boarding house. I'd left it charging on the nightstand next to James's photo. The battery had filled to 100%, but I didn't feel full. I felt empty, in the way that left room for something new. There were 14 missed calls, 3 from Paul, 2 from Diane, 9 from a number I didn't recognize. I scrolled to the texts. Paul, Mom, where are you? This isn't funny. Diane, we're worried. Please call us. Paul, I don't know why you just vanish. This is childish. And then, Paul, did you touch the investment account? We're missing access. There it was. The real concern, wrapped in digital desperation. Not are you safe? Not we love you. But did you take the money? I stared at the last message a long time. My thumb hovered over the reply icon, then dropped. I locked the screen, slipped the phone in a drawer, and turned back to the tea I'd forgotten to finish. Outside the window, someone was painting a fence. I watched the careful strokes of the brush. White over gray, new over old. I liked that. Later that day, I walked to the little flower shop down the block. It smelled of soil and lavender, and the woman behind the counter wore an apron that said "Joy is dirt-stained." I bought a single potted lily, small, modest, but it felt alive. You planting for a garden? The woman asked. No, I said, for a table that's been empty too long. She smiled, like she understood exactly what I meant. I carried the plant home gently, like a newborn thought. That evening, I checked my email, not out of curiosity, but out of responsibility. A notification from the bank had arrived. Your beneficiary update has been processed successfully. Account ending in 3ID24 now lists Elijah C. as primary recipient. No fanfare, no blinking warning signs, just a quiet transaction reshaping the future. I leaned back in the chair, letting the confirmation settle like a weight lifted. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing it because kindness deserved inheritance more than bloodline. Around 7 p.m., the landline in the shared hallway rang. I almost ignored it, but something in the timing pulled me toward it. The others on the floor rarely answered, most were students or night workers. Hello? I said softly into the receiver. There was a pause, then Paul's voice, thin with restraint. Mom? I closed my eyes briefly. Yes. You're okay? I am. A long exhale. You scared us. No, I said gently. You were confused by silence. That's different. Another pause. Then, why'd you leave like that? Why not talk to us? Because I did, I said. For years, but no one was listening. You left a note, he muttered, like you were making a point. I stayed quiet. He added, and the accounts, why did you lock us out? I opened my eyes, staring at the dust-specked window across the hall. I didn't lock you out. I reclaimed what was mine. I don't understand, he said. No, I agreed. You don't. The line hummed between us like an old radio. Then Paul said, more quietly, Kayla cried when she realized you were gone. That nearly cracked me. But I held firm. Did she ask why? She said she misses you. I nodded, even though he couldn't see. Tell her I miss who we were, too. There was another silence. Then, oddly vulnerable, he asked, are you ever coming back? No, I said, not unkindly, but I'm not gone. I've just moved somewhere I can breathe again. He didn't argue, he just said, okay, like a man trying to memorize a goodbye. After we hung up, I stood in the hall for a long time, hand still on the phone. The door to my unit creaked slightly in the breeze from the open window. I could smell the faint sweetness of the lily on my table. There was grief in this. Of course there was. But it was the kind of grief that knew its shape. It didn't startle me anymore. The next day, Eli met me for coffee at a local diner. He noticed the subtle lines beneath my eyes. You okay? He asked. Yes, I said. I finally slept through the night. He smiled and passed over a small manila envelope. Inside were printed copies of the updated legal documents. Notarized, signed, sealed. I reached across the table and touched his wrist briefly. Thank you, I said, for listening. Thank you, he replied, for trusting me. We sat for a while, in comfortable silence. Then, as we were about to leave, I looked out the window and saw a little girl in pigtails crouching to tie her own shoe. She wasn't crying, she wasn't calling for help. She was just focused, determined. Reminds me of Kayla at that age, I murmured. Eli looked too. She looks like she knows who she is. Yes, I said, finishing the last sip of my tea. That's how it starts. That evening, I hung the first thing on the wall in my little room. A watercolor of a tree I painted long ago, back when I believed everything would stay rooted forever. It wasn't straight. The frame was chipped, but I liked it that way. It was honest. The week settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with the squeak of the old faucet, tea steeping in its chipped mug, and the soft shuffle of slippers against tile. I started keeping the window open, wide enough to let in the city breeze, but not the noise. From my chair, I could see the tops of elm trees bowing gently in the wind. That became my new clock. I'd stopped checking my phone entirely. It buzzed sometimes from the drawer, but I'd long since decided that most calls weren't invitations. They were demands disguised as concern. Instead, I began journaling again. I wrote what I remembered, conversations, fragments of days, things Paul said when he still believed my time was infinite. I didn't write with sadness. I wrote to preserve clarity, to reclaim the story before someone else told it for me. Eli came by the following Thursday. He brought a bag of groceries, fruit, crackers, chamomile tea, and an envelope from his mother. Inside was a card. If I had known kindness still lived in strangers, I would have opened the door sooner. Thank you for reminding me. Marlene C. I held the card to my chest a moment longer than I meant to. That kind of gesture used to be rare. Now, it felt extended. She made it through another round, Eli said quietly, pouring us each a glass of water. Tough as nails, that woman. She raised you, I replied. Of course she is. He smiled, but it didn't fully reach his eyes. Her doctors don't think we'll get another year. I pretend I don't hear that part. I nodded. Sometimes pretending is just buying time to build strength. We sat in silence, comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then he looked up, more serious. There's something I need to tell you, and ask. All right, I said, setting my glass down. My mom wants to meet you. I blinked. Why? Because I talk about you, like your family, and she doesn't like mysteries. I let the idea sink in. A stranger I'd once helped in a grocery lot, now asking to introduce me to his dying mother. What would I say to her? Whatever you want. Or nothing at all. She just wants to see the woman who reminded her she raised a good man. That silenced me, in the gentlest way. The visit was arranged for Sunday afternoon. Eli offered to drive, but I insisted on meeting them there. I didn't want to arrive like cargo. I wanted to choose when and how I entered the next part of my story. The facility was cleaner than I expected. No sterile hospital smell, just lemon polish and a hint of eucalyptus. The room they'd given her had a window facing the garden and a shelf full of paperbacks, a warm throw blanket draped over the recliner, and on the wall hung a photo of a much younger Eli, freckles, missing tooth, bowl-cut bangs. When I stepped in, Marlene turned her head slowly. Her eyes were faded, but alert. "You're Eleanor," she said, voice dry but strong. I nodded, unsure whether to sit or stand. "You're taller than I pictured." "I get that a lot," I said, which made her laugh, a soft, wheezing chuckle that filled the space between us. I took the seat beside her, careful to let the silence lead. "I hear you've been writing your own ending," she said. "I've been taking the pen back, yes." Marlene looked out the window for a moment, then back to me. "Do you ever wonder if we raised them too soft?" I smiled gently. "No, I think we raised them to forget we were ever anything but parents, and they assumed we'd stay frozen that way." She nodded slowly, her fingers picking at the corner of her blanket. "They treat me like a lamp," she muttered. "Pretty at first, then inconvenient when it flickers." I reached out and rested my hand on hers. "You're not a lamp, you're the current." That made her cry. We talked for hours, about our sons, our illnesses, our foolish hopes. We didn't talk about death. We didn't need to. When it was time to leave, she gripped my hand tighter than I expected. "Thank you for making space for us in your story. You gave me a place in yours first." She nodded. And that was all. Outside, Eli was waiting by his car. "How was she?" "She's still very much alive," I said, "and still capable of mischief." He laughed. "Yeah, that's Mom." I looked at him for a long moment, unsure how to express what I felt. "You know," I said, "there's a freedom in giving your legacy to someone who didn't expect it." Eli tilted his head. "It means they never feel entitled to it, which means they're more likely to earn it." His face softened. "You're changing my life," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You just gave me the permission to stop letting others reduce it." That night, back in my small room, I opened the window wider than usual. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I lit a small candle on the desk and sat beside the flickering light, journal in my lap. I wrote a single sentence. Today, I was someone's beginning. It was a Wednesday when they found me again. I had just finished watering the lily, which had begun to bloom more fully than I expected. Its white petals, curled like secrets unfolding, soft and confident. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, savoring the quiet. Then came the knock. 3 hard raps, not the kind neighbors give when borrowing sugar. I opened the door slowly. Paul stood there, stiff-backed, his eyes uncertain. Diane was just behind him, arms crossed like she was guarding something. They looked too polished for this street, too careful, like people trying to appear normal in a place that didn't require it. "Mom," Paul said, with a breath that didn't quite finish the word. "Can we come in?" I stepped aside, not because I owed them, but because I was curious what apology might sound like in their voices. They entered like visitors at a museum exhibit, glancing at the modest table, the cracked teacup on the counter, the potted plant on the sill, as if searching for signs of failure. "You moved," Diane said flatly. "I did." Paul sat on the edge of the bed, which doubled as my sofa now. He looked around again, then down at his hands. "We've been worried." "You've been curious," I corrected. Diane huffed. "Is that really fair?" I turned to her, calmly. "Is it fair that you called me a burden before my chair was even warm?" Paul cut in. "That's not what she meant. She said it. You let her. You heard it, and still passed the mashed potatoes." They fell silent. Finally Paul cleared his throat. "Look, there's something we need to discuss." I tilted my head. "Let me guess. My accounts?" His face flushed. "You changed everything, without saying a word." "I had to," I said. "You weren't listening when I used them." "I thought we were a family," he muttered. And families don't sell each other off in whispers, I said. You weren't worried about me. You were worried about what I might still own. Diane's jaw tensed. That's not true. No, then why do you care who the money went to? Because it was supposed to be part of the estate. My estate? I smiled. I wasn't aware I had already died. The room chilled for a moment. Paul stood. We didn't come to argue. Then why did you come at all? He looked at me, not past me, not through me, but directly. It startled me how much older he looked in that moment. Not from time, from guilt. I miss you, he said. Even if I didn't say it when I should have. I studied him. My son. The boy who used to beg me to braid his hair like the girls at school. The man who forgot I had dreams before he was born. I believe you, I said. But you miss me now because I'm gone. Not because you remembered who I am. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. A photo, frayed at the edges. It was of us. On the porch. I had my arms around him. He was grinning with 2 missing teeth. James had taken it. I recognized the angle. I found this in the attic, Paul said quietly. I didn't know I'd kept it. I took the photo. My fingers brushed the memory. It hit harder than I expected. Not pain, just weight. Thank you, I said, and tucked it inside my cardigan pocket. Diane finally spoke again. So, what now? Now, I said gently. I keep living, and you keep learning how to live with choices that had consequences. Paul exhaled, not angrily, not defeated, just tired. Will we see you again? I looked at him. Maybe, but not at your house. I've made enough entrances where I wasn't truly welcome. He nodded, slowly. He understood. Diane said nothing. Her silence this time wasn't contempt, it was the absence of confidence. A woman whose script had ended earlier than expected. They left without slamming the door. That mattered to me. Small gestures do. After they disappeared down the hallway, I stood for a moment in the center of the room, the air oddly still. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just breathed in the space I had chosen. I walked back to the table and opened the drawer where I kept my journal. I wrote down everything, their words. My restraint, the look in Paul's eyes when he handed me that photo. And at the end, I wrote, forgiveness is not owed. It is offered when the soul is full enough to share. That evening, I hung the photo above the lily. It didn't feel like regression. It felt like acknowledgement. You can mourn something and still not return to it. Later that night, I sat by the window. Eli had promised to visit the next day with a surprise, and I found myself oddly excited, but not anxious. I had no desire to predict, only to receive. I let the cool air settle into my bones. I was not a sick grandma. I was a woman with a name, a past, and finally, a future that was mine alone. Eli arrived the next morning, right on time, carrying a brown cardboard box with both hands and a crooked grin that made him look younger than he was. You brought a bomb? I asked, half amused. Clothes, he said, stepping inside. But prettier, and more likely to bloom. He set the box gently on my small kitchen table. I followed, wiping my hands on a dish towel, and tilted my head like a curious crow. Inside was a collection of seed packets, wildflowers, basil, marigolds, even snapdragons, along with a plastic trowel and a pair of soft gloves in my size. At the very bottom lay a weathered canvas satchel. I remembered what you said about gardening, Eli said. Thought maybe you'd want to start something here. Doesn't have to be big. I looked at him for a long moment. There's no dirt on this floor. He chuckled. Then let's find some. We walked together to the community lot, 2 blocks away, a sliver of land wedged between a shuttered laundromat and a rusted auto repair garage. It wasn't much to look at, a chain-link fence, cracked soil, tufts of crabgrass reaching up like forgotten children, but in the far left corner there was a raised bed that hadn't been claimed, a small wooden stake labeled 12B stuck out like a placeholder waiting to matter. This one's been empty all year, Eli said. No one showed up for it. I stepped forward and bent slowly, pressing my fingers into the earth. Dry but not dead, like skin that hadn't been touched in a while, but remembered the feeling. I'll take it, I whispered. Eli smiled. That afternoon, I returned with the satchel, a thermos of water, and the small shovel. I planted basil first, then the snapdragons. Then one line of marigolds along the back where the sun stretched longest. I didn't rush. Each seed was a conversation, a confession, a commit. As I worked, I caught glimpses of other people tending their own patches, a teenage boy with headphones weeding methodically, an older woman humming softly as she watered squash vines. No one asked me questions. No one assumed I needed help. That was its own kind of welcome. By evening, my knees ached, and there was soil beneath every fingernail, but I hadn't felt more grounded in years. I returned home with streaks on my blouse and the scent of thyme on my sleeves. I filled the kettle and poured myself a cup of mint tea, then sat at the window and looked out, even though I couldn't see the garden from here. I could feel it, a place that didn't ask what I could offer beyond presence. The next morning, I received mail for the first time in this building. Not bills, not flyers, an actual envelope with my name in ink. The return address was from Marlene. Inside was a handwritten note on pale pink stationery. "Thank you for sitting beside me, like we'd always known each other. That kind of comfort is rare when time is short. You made my boy proud. And you reminded me that kindness isn't an accident. It's a decision repeated until it becomes a way of being." At the bottom, she had drawn a tiny flower, perhaps a marigold, though it was only a sketch. I held the letter to my chest and let the words settle. Later that day, I pinned the letter beside the photograph Paul had given me. They didn't belong to the same chapter, but they both lived in my story now, and I was no longer interested in hiding parts to make anyone comfortable. Grief, gratitude, and growth. They could all live in the same room. So could memory and distance. So could goodbye and forgiveness. Around dusk, I walked back to plot 12B. Some of the marigolds had already lifted their heads slightly. Not blooming, not yet, but aware. I brought a small folding chair this time, the kind you'd see at soccer games. I sat, sipping from a bottle of water, listening to the rustle of leaves and far-off traffic. The garden wasn't silent, but it wasn't loud either. It just existed, unapologetically alive. Eli showed up halfway through twilight. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me on the edge of the bed and picked at a stray weed. "You're here late," I said. "So are you?" We shared a moment without narration, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything. Then he pulled out his phone. "Do you want me to take a photo of you here?" I looked at the bed, at the soil-streaked gloves in my lap, at the shoots just starting to surface. "No," I said, "some things are meant to be remembered from inside." After he left, I sat alone a while longer, watching the sky darken into its navy hush. I thought about how easily people mistake silence for emptiness. But silence can hold roots too. Eventually, I stood and wiped the dirt from my hands, the knees of my slacks dusted with memory. I packed up slowly and made my way back to my room, my sanctuary, my earned solitude. I passed the mirror before undressing, and for the first time in a long while, I looked at my reflection without critiquing it. The lines around my eyes didn't feel like loss, they felt like documentation, proof that I had watched, and waited, and endured. And now, finally, planting. The marigolds bloomed faster than expected. 3 weeks after planting, their golden faces tilted toward the morning sun with the boldness of something that had waited too long to be seen. I tended them gently, almost reverently, brushing away the light dust that settled overnight on their petals. I had forgotten how intimate gardening was, not just with the soil, but with yourself. People started noticing. The teenager with the headphones nodded to me now as he passed. The older woman who once hummed had begun leaving small bundles of thyme and mint on the corner of my bed with a scribbled note, "Extra from mine. Yours looks promising." We never exchanged names, only recognition. I liked it that way. No expectations, no assumptions, just shared earth and sun. One Thursday morning, while stirring oatmeal over my tiny stove, a knock at the door broke the rhythm. Not Eli. His knocks were 2 soft taps, polite as a question. This one was firmer, direct. I opened the door to find a woman about my age, though better preserved in the way only money and avoidance could provide. Her blazer was too crisp for summer, and her eyes scanned the hallway before meeting mine. "Eliza Harper?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "Used to be." Her expression twitched. "I'm Meredith Shaw. I'm with Langford and Shaw, your husband's former firm." My stomach clenched, involuntarily. That name. It felt like someone pronouncing a ghost. She stepped forward. "May I let her in, not out of trust, but because I wanted to hear what tether had pulled her all the way to this hallway. She declined tea, sat upright in the chair across from the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap like she'd been trained not to fidget. I apologize for the intrusion. I didn't know where else to reach you. You seem to have managed. She nodded once, acknowledging the barb without biting. Mr. Whitlock, James's old partner, passed away last month. As we were closing certain accounts, we found documentation, rather unusual documentation. A second portfolio in your name, untouched. My heart thudded. I assumed it was absorbed after James died. That's what we thought as well. But apparently, he made independent adjustments a year before his passing. Very quietly, she opened a manila envelope and placed a few documents before me. My name, my maiden name, a second signature. His. He'd kept it aside, hidden. For me. James, I whispered, not realizing I'd said it aloud. Meredith gave me a moment. I'm not here to offer legal advice, she said, softer now. Just clarity. This isn't money anyone else has claim to, not even your son. It's yours. Untouched. Yours. I stared at the numbers. Not millions, but enough. Enough to feel like I'd been remembered, protected. Why tell me now? Because James wanted you to have something that was never conditional. Her words struck like warm lightning. And, she added carefully, because you changed your will recently. That caught our attention. I looked up, sharply. It was flagged when your family contested your living arrangements. Apparently they claimed you were acting under duress, that perhaps you weren't, of sound mind. I laughed once, short and bitter. Of course they did. Meredith looked at me long enough to weigh her next words. We reviewed your mental competency evaluation. Impeccable. And Eli, the one listed as power of attorney, has no financial conflict. Everything holds. I nodded. Good. She stood and straightened her jacket. We'll need your signature on a few things to close the loop. I'll leave them here. I walked her to the door. She hesitated at the threshold. Do you want to keep the name on your old trust? She asked. It still reads as Eleanor Harper. I looked at her, then at the hallway behind her, the peeling paint, the scratched floor, the new life I'd carved out without permission. No, I said. Let's use just Eleanor. She smiled, the first real smile she'd shown. That's a fine name to stand alone. After she left, I sat at the table, envelope in hand, documents spread before me, like a quiet rebirth. My thumb ran over James's signature, familiar, angular, unshaken. A secret kindness. He had known, somehow, known that one day I might need to feel that someone had chosen me without asking for anything in return. Not even gratitude. That evening, I visited the garden. The air smelled like warm bark and watered roots. I brought a single candle, small and citrus-scented, and placed it in the corner of the bed. No ceremony, no speech, just light. I whispered, thank you, to the air, and that was enough. Back home, I placed James's papers in the drawer beside the marigold note from Marlene and the photo Paul had given me. My history wasn't seamless, but it was mine now, end to end, and I would carry it, without shame. The first real autumn breeze arrived 2 days later. It came through the kitchen window like a quiet announcement, rattling the hanging spoons above the sink and sending a ripple through the sheer curtain. I welcomed it. I had started associating cool air with clarity, with things settling into their rightful place. I sat at the table with a fresh sheet of stationery and James's pen, the one I hadn't touched since the day he passed. A dark green fountain pen, still full of ink, still smooth as silk on paper. I wasn't writing a will. I wasn't leaving instructions. I was writing a letter to myself. The version of me who months ago had stood on her son's doorstep, holding a casserole and a slowly breaking heart. The one who tried to ignore how her bedroom was suddenly temporary and how conversations always changed when she walked into the room. She deserved something honest. You did not disappear. You were erased. Then you redrew yourself, stroke by stroke. And that, Eleanor, is something no one can take from you. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into the drawer beside my journal. A small part of me wanted someone to find it one day. Maybe Eli, maybe no one. It didn't matter. It had already served its purpose. I spent the afternoon in the garden. The basil had taken beautifully, thick with scent and promise. I trimmed a handful and placed it in a small paper pouch to dry by my windowsill. The marigolds were still thriving, though their color had deepened to a richer gold, burnished and mature. Other gardeners waved now. The teenager even removed his headphones to ask about my watering routine. I told him the truth. Talk to them, I said. Even if they don't listen, talking helps. He blinked, confused but respectful, and nodded. When I returned home, the landline rang. Only a handful of people had the number, and my stomach tensed as I picked it up. Hello? Mom. It was Paul, his voice lower than usual, not shaky, just slowed down, like someone trying to get it right on the first try. I wanted to talk. I leaned against the counter. Go ahead. I know you've made your choices. And I know you probably don't need to hear anything from me. But I owe you something. I said nothing. He went on. Diane and we separated. A week ago. My heart didn't leap. It didn't break. It did something quieter. It acknowledged. I didn't see things clearly, he continued. I let her convince me that caring for you meant losing something, that it would be a burden, not a privilege. I exhaled slowly. Not forgiveness, just breath. She's not a bad person, he said. But she was never going to understand how much I owed you. And do you? I asked softly. There was a pause. I do now. I walked to the window and looked out at the swaying curtain. The street below was calm, the afternoon giving way to golden light. You don't owe me gratitude, Paul, I said. You owe yourself accountability. That's harder. But it lasts longer. He didn't argue. He just said, I've started therapy. I know that's just a start. But I want to do the work. That word work meant more to me than any apology could. Good, I said. Then don't waste your time trying to fix the past. Build something better from it. I'd like to visit, not to ask for anything, just to talk. I let the silence stretch, then spoke carefully. Not yet, but maybe. He understood. I'll wait, he said, as long as it takes. After the call ended, I sat by the window for a while, not thinking, just being. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt intact. That was new. That night, Eli dropped by with 2 coffees and a bag of groceries. We unpacked them in easy silence. A new ritual. Not for survival, for company. I handed him a small bundle of dried basil. For your mom, I said. She'll be thrilled. She loves it on everything. Even toast? I teased. Especially toast. He noticed the photo and letter on the wall, now joined by a small handmade wreath, just marigold stems twisted together and dried. You building a gallery? He asked. No, I said. I'm building evidence. Of what? That I was here, fully, even if no one else wrote it down. He leaned against the counter. You ever think about moving? I turned toward him. Why? You trying to kick me out already? He laughed, shaking his head. No, just, this building isn't exactly cozy. And now, with what you have access to, you could have better. I thought about that for a long second. I don't want better, I want earned. He tilted his head. What does that mean? It means this place doesn't try to pretend it's something it's not. I like that. And I like that the heat clinks in the walls and the neighbors leave muffins without names. Eli smiled. You're something else, you know that? I shrugged. I tried being someone else. Didn't take. After he left, I stood at the threshold of my room. The light was soft, golden, from the last fingers of sunset. The scent of basil still lingered in the air. I walked to my desk, opened my journal, and wrote, Sometimes healing is not a sunrise. Sometimes it's a door that stays open when no one walks through it. Then I closed the cover, turned off the lamp, and sat beside the window in the quiet, not waiting, just resting. It was Eli's idea to host a harvest gathering. Not a full dinner party that would have felt like too much for this building, just something small, real. A table outside in the courtyard, some homemade food, a string of lights if we could get them up in time. I raised an eyebrow when he brought it up. Harvest? I asked, peering at him over my tea. What are we harvesting? Patience? He laughed. Herbs, tomatoes, maybe gratitude. I shook my head, but my lips betrayed me with a smile. You're sentimental. I learned from the best. We planned it for Saturday afternoon. I spent most of Friday chopping, kneading, baking. dusting off recipes I hadn't touched in years. My hands knew what to do before my mind caught up. I was surprised by how natural it felt to prepare things for others again, without obligation, without fear of being dismissed halfway through dessert. I made my late husband's rosemary bread, added mint to the lemonade, and folded cloth napkins like I used to for Sunday lunches. No one wanted to leave. This time, no one would leave early because they were bored. They would stay because they were full, because they wanted to. Eli strung up the lights between the posts of the courtyard gate and the fire escape. A teenager from the building offered to DJ with a small speaker. The older woman, with the time, sent over a tart with figs and honey, even the handyman. Maurice brought a stack of mismatched chairs from storage with a grin that said more than any RSVP could. By noon, the table was set. 12 places, each with a ceramic plate, real silverware, and a cloth napkin, a mason jar of flowers in the center, basil, marigolds, snapdragons, things we had all grown with patient hands and minimal certainty. It wasn't a grand table, but it was honest. People came. Not all at once. Not loudly. They trickled in like stories, one after another. Some brought dishes, others brought only themselves. One woman brought her newborn and left the stroller under the stairs. A man I didn't know handed me a bag of oranges and said, "Your herbs saved my soup last week." There was no music at first. Just forks against plates, soft greetings, chairs scraping against concrete. But it wasn't awkward. It was collective breath. A shared permission to belong. When I sat down, I realized no one had assigned seats. And yet there I was, head of the table, without a name card. It was never about position, it was about presence. Eli clinked his glass softly and stood. "Some of you know Eleanor," he said, gesturing toward me with open hands. "Some of you met her in the garden. Some of you have heard me brag about her lemon biscuits." Laughter, gentle and kind. "But what you may not know," he continued, "is that this table wouldn't be here without her. Not just because she helped plan it, but because she reminded some of us, myself included, that community is a verb. You don't just have it, you do it." He turned to me. "Thank you." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not the kind that comes from shame, but from being seen. I stood, slowly. Everyone quieted. "I used to host dinners," I said. "Years ago, my table was longer, but it never felt this full." A pause. I spent a long time thinking I had to be invited to matter, that if someone didn't set a place for me, I didn't belong. I glanced around at their faces, young, old, in between, some curious, some knowing. But today, I helped build the table, and that's a kind of belonging no one can take from you. Applause followed, not thunderous, but warm and steady, like rain on a roof you no longer fear will leak. We ate, we laughed. Someone passed around a phone with an old dance playlist, and before I knew it, 2 of the teens had coaxed me into doing a few steps of the jitterbug. My knees ached, but my soul did not. Even the landlord stopped by, only briefly, but long enough to grab a cookie and compliment the festive atmosphere. I didn't ask anyone to stay. I didn't have to. They lingered because the air felt good around the table. No posturing, no performance, just people who had shared something that had roots. When the light began to fade, Eli helped me carry the remaining plates back inside. We moved slowly, not out of fatigue, but to stretch the evening a little longer. "You looked happy," he said, rinsing a jar in the sink. "I was. I am." "Was this better than what you used to have?" I thought for a moment, wiping down the counter. "It's not better, it's freer." Eli leaned against the fridge, arms crossed. "Will you ever go back to them? To Paul?" He nodded. I dried my hands on a towel. Maybe, but not as who I was, only as who I am now. Later, when the courtyard was quiet and the dishes were stacked, I stepped outside one last time. The table still stood there, empty now. A few flower petals scattered by the wind, but it didn't look abandoned. It looked complete. Like a chapter that had ended the right way. I sat in one of the chairs, wrapped in my cardigan, the sky a velvet indigo above. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, a window slammed shut. Life resumed, but around me, the stillness held. I looked at the table, then I whispered. I made room, and this time, it echoed back, not as a question, but as confirmation. It was late morning when the knock came. Not the brisk double tap of Eli, or the slow, practiced rhythm of the mailman. This knock was hesitant, uncertain, like someone who'd rehearsed it too many times and still didn't trust the result. I stood still in the middle of the kitchen, a dish towel in one hand and a half-cut apple in the other. I knew before I opened the door. Paul. His hair was shorter, saltier. He wore a navy coat he'd long outgrown, but hadn't replaced. His eyes, once so quick to narrow in judgment, held something slower now, like he'd spent the last few months in conversations with regret. "Hi, Mom." My breath came slowly. "Hello, Paul." He looked down, then back at me. I was passing through. "That's not true." He offered a small, crooked smile. "No, it's not." I didn't move. I didn't invite him in. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. "You're doing it." "I mean, really talk." I thought of the table in the courtyard, the empty chair I'd sat in the night after the gathering. "There's a bench outside," I said. "Not as warm as it was, but it'll do." He nodded and followed me down the stairs in silence. We sat, side by side on the bench, under the metal staircase, leaves gathered around our feet. The basil patch across the courtyard had started to thin, the stems a little wilted, but not gone. Autumn had settled in, not with a bang, but with a sigh. "I came to tell you something," he began, his fingers gripping his knees like anchor points. "I've been working at a hospice center, volunteering, mostly." I turned to him. That I hadn't expected. "I wanted to learn," he said, "to listen, to understand what it feels like when someone's nearing the end and still wants to matter." I blinked, slowly. And I've heard things that sound like your voice." That cracked me a little. He went on. "There was this woman last week, 83, cancer. No family visited. She said, they think I stopped existing when I started needing help." I let the silence stretch. Not to punish him, just to allow the truth to land properly. "I said those words to you," he said, "in other forms, but I said them." "You did. I'm not asking for you to forget it." "Good," I said, "because I haven't." He looked at me then, not as a son, as a man trying to climb out of himself. "I've rewritten my will," he said. "Removed the clauses Diane made me add, the ones that counted on you leaving something behind." I stared forward. "You didn't have to tell me that." "I know. I wanted to." A sparrow landed on the courtyard fence just then, hopping along the beam like a punctuation mark waiting for its sentence. Paul followed my gaze. "Eli told me you built the garden," he said quietly. "He said it's more than soil and herbs, that it's healing." "He's not wrong," I murmured. "I'd like to see it." I stood. "Come on then." The beds were quieter now, the flowers less loud in color, but still upright, still proud. We walked slowly past the mint, the thyme, the patch where marigolds had once flared like gold trumpets. I knelt near a plot that had gone half bare and picked up a fallen snapdragon petal. I rubbed it between my fingers and looked up at Paul. "Gardens don't forget," I said, "but they forgive in their own way." He looked down at me and nodded. "That's what I'm hoping for, not your forgiveness, your way of living after it." I stood and wiped my hands. "You know," I said, "I used to think letting go meant erasing, but it doesn't. It means placing things where they belong so they don't rot the rest of the story." Paul's voice was tight. "And where do I belong now?" I held his gaze. "That's for you to figure out. But you can start near the edges and work your way in, if you're willing to get your hands dirty." He smiled faintly, tears forming but not falling. "I am back in my apartment." I made tea while he stood awkwardly near the door. "Still the same kitchen smell," he said. "It's basil. And a bit of toast." He nodded. "It always smelled like safety." That nearly undid me. We sat at the table, the same one where Eli and I had once reviewed my revised will. Paul looked at the wall where the marigold wreath still hung. His eyes softened at the photo, the one he'd given me weeks ago. "You kept it?" "Of course I did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another photo. This one was newer. Me, seated in the courtyard, laughing mid-sentence. Eli must have taken it during the gathering. "I found this online," Paul said. "One of the neighbors posted it, said, 'The woman who built something with her bare hands and invited us all to stay.'" I took the photo, studied it, my head thrown back, laughter unguarded. "That woman looks free." I said. She is, he replied. I hope she can let me in. Not all at once, just slowly. I folded the photo and placed it beside the first. Then start with T, I said, and bring something next time. A story, not a reason. He nodded, quietly emotional. I will. When he left, the room felt fuller somehow. Not in a suffocating way, in a mended way. A seam pulled together but not hidden. I went to my journal and wrote, there is no perfect reconciliation, only attempts. And sometimes, the attempt is the grace. I closed the cover gently and breathed in the cooling light. The first frost came overnight. I noticed it in the way the marigolds bent just slightly toward the ground, petals curling in at the edges like tired fingers. The basil, once lively and fragrant, had faded into brittle stems, their green muted to gray. I stood at the edge of my garden plot that morning, wrapped in a shawl Eli's mother had knitted for me. The cold didn't bite, it nudged, like it wanted to remind me that time moves forward, whether we approve or not. There was something peaceful in that. Finality had a sound, the crackle of frost underfoot, the whisper of wind moving through the bones of things that had bloomed and given all they had. I crouched, gloved hands brushing gently against the soil, and whispered a thank you to each patch. You did your part, I murmured. Now rest. Back inside, I boiled water for tea and reached for the small wooden box tucked beneath my bed. It was one of the few things I'd brought from Paul's house when I left, though I never told him. Inside were letters I'd never mailed, some addressed to him, others to James, a few to no one in particular, some I'd written during long nights in a guest bedroom that never stopped feeling temporary, others while sitting in parking lots, pretending I was too early for an appointment. One, folded more than the rest, had been written on a hospital discharge summary. The night I realized, Diane had scheduled a family trip while I was still in recovery. I unfolded it carefully. I know you think you're protecting me by keeping me out of the way. I just wish you realized that people don't stop being whole when they become fragile. I am not my illness. I am not an inconvenience. I am your mother. I stared at the last line. The way my handwriting sloped harder as it reached the period, like I was trying to push the truth in with force. I never sent it. There hadn't been a point then. But reading it now, I didn't feel bitterness, only distance. That version of me was still mine, but I had grown past her grief. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it didn't define me anymore. That afternoon, I walked to the post office, not with that letter, but with another. A handwritten thank you note to the Community Garden Committee, asking to formally adopt Plot 12B next year. I included a short paragraph about the herbs that thrived and the neighbors who'd stayed late to water the beds in August heat. At the bottom, I signed not just my name, but added something new. Caretaker, storyteller, replanted. 3 truths I had earned. When I returned, I found Eli, waiting by the stairs. He was holding something behind his back, and wearing the kind of grin people have when they know they're about to be yelled at and do it anyway. What did you do? I asked, squinting at him. He revealed a small framed certificate, not fancy, just printed paper in a cheap glass frame. It read, "In recognition of Eleanor's garden, for growing things that could not speak for themselves." I pressed my lips together. You're ridiculous. I know, he said. But you're also not going to throw it away. I took the frame in my hands. It was lighter than I expected, but it sat heavy with meaning. You've made more change than you think, he added. Some of the teens asked if we could start a compost bin next season. Maurice wants to build benches. You sparked something. I looked at the certificate again. I didn't mean to, I said. That's how you know it's real. That evening, I rearranged the shelf above my writing desk. I cleared out some of the knickknacks that had followed me over the years and placed the certificate front and center, next to the marigold wreath and Paul's photo of me laughing. Below it, I tacked up a new piece of paper, blank for now, but titled, Next Season's Notes. Not a bucket list, not a schedule, just space, room for possibilities. As I sat at the desk, pen in hand, but unsure what to write, a knock came at the door. This time, it was soft and warm. Expected, even if unscheduled. I opened it to find Paul standing there, no coat, holding a thermos and a wrapped cloth bundle. I made soup, he said. I figured you hadn't eaten yet. I have. Oh. He paused, embarrassed. Well, now you have more. I stepped aside. Come in. We sat at the table in silence as he unwrapped the bundle, 2 slices of buttered rye and a small container of carrot soup. It smelled of thyme and memory. You cooked? I asked. Diane did all the cooking before. I figured it was time I learned. I nodded and dipped a spoon into the bowl. The soup was too salty. The bread was a little burnt, but I finished every bite. When he left, he paused at the door. I know I'll never undo what happened, he said, but I hope I can be part of what happens next. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the shelf behind him, at the photo, the certificate, the empty paper. Then I said, one bowl of soup at a time. That night, I returned to the box under my bed. I removed the hospital letter, read it one last time, then carefully tore it into small squares. The pieces didn't scatter. They stayed in a neat pile on the desk until I carried them to the trash. I didn't need them anymore. I wasn't writing from pain now. I was writing from growth. The first snow arrived without drama. No storm warnings, no eager children racing to windows, just a hush in the early hours, a slow cloaking of rooftops and railings, the soft way a city seems to pause when white settles over rust and noise. I stood at the window with my tea cooling beside me. The trees in the courtyard were bare now, their branches sketching quiet questions across the sky. It had been a full year since I'd left Paul's house, since I'd redefined what safety meant, since I stopped asking for space and started creating it. And today, I would close the loop. I laid the folder out on the table carefully. It was thick now, thicker than it had any right to be, not because of legal jargon or estate instructions, but because I had filled it with something else over the past months. Intention, letters, deeds, notes of affirmation, clear boundaries, and clearer gifts. I had rewritten my will with the same care I once reserved for Sunday recipes. I knew the headlines, if anyone ever got hold of it, old woman leaves fortune to stranger. But Eli wasn't a stranger. Not anymore. He was the one who showed up with groceries and never made me feel like a burden, who fixed the broken radiator without expecting cookies in return, though he got them anyway, who helped string lights, build compost bins, and quietly introduced me to parts of myself I thought had retired long ago. I was not leaving him money. I was leaving him a garden, both literal and lived. The title to the plot, The Journal of Planting Seasons. My final batch of heirloom seeds from the locked tin in my dresser, and the apartment. Not out of charity, but because he had earned it. Not by asking, but by showing up. I'd left a letter too, folded in cream-colored paper and sealed with the kind of wax stamp James used to use for invitations. Dear Eli, you never asked me for anything. That's why I trust you with everything that matters. Let this place continue to be what it became, under your care. A refuge, a learning space, a second chance. And if someday a woman with tired eyes and a quiet story knocks on the gate, offer her tea before you ask her name. With love, Eleanor. I slipped the letter into the folder and buttoned it shut, then placed it into the canvas tote with the winter pattern on it. Snowflakes, bluebirds, fir trees. By the door I pulled on my warm coat, the one with the inside pocket for tissues and mints, and knotted a soft scarf around my neck. I added lipstick, not out of vanity, but as ritual, a touch of color for a day that held meaning. Eli was already outside, shoveling the steps. He turned when he heard the door open. Morning, he called. Careful, it's slick. But I was already holding up the tote. I have something for you, I said. Come sit for a moment. We moved to the bench by the courtyard, now dusted with a thin layer of snow. He brushed it off with his sleeve and sat, blinking at the folder as I placed it in his lap. What's this? He asked. My garden, I said, and everything that comes with it. He opened it slowly, cautiously, like it might shatter under his fingers. When he reached the letter, he paused, glanced at me, then looked away to give me privacy as he read. His breath caught just once. When he folded it again, his eyes shimmered with something raw. I don't know what to say, he murmured. You already said it, months ago. Every time you showed up. I'm not family. You're my family. The wind picked up slightly, sending a swirl of snow between our feet. The courtyard was silent, except for the occasional creak of a shutter. I can't promise I'll do everything right, he said after a while. You don't have to. Just keep the soil soft, keep the door open, let people grow. He nodded, biting his lower lip to keep it steady. Then, quietly, he said, "I'll take care of it." I smiled. "I know." Later that day, I visited Paul one last time, not to reopen anything, but to offer what little still needed saying. He greeted me, at the door, with 2 mugs of tea, and a smile I recognized. Not from childhood, but from recently, the one that knew silence could be sacred. We didn't talk about the inheritance. I didn't explain the decision. It wasn't about exclusion. It was about legacy. Instead, we talked about soup, about Eli, about the way a city feels different after a snowfall. He didn't press. I think, in his own way, he understood. Before I left, he gave me a small wooden carving, something he'd made himself. A basil leaf, smoothed and shaped into a pendant. "It's not much," he said. "It's enough." That night, I stood at my window again. The streetlights glowed like softened lanterns. The snow had started again, small flakes, drifting lazily, without urgency. I wrapped the pendant around my wrist like a charm bracelet. I thought of everything that had changed, not in a thunderclap, but in slow, patient inches, like a seed pushing toward the light with no audience. I thought of the letter I'd written to myself months ago. You were erased. You redrew yourself, stroke by stroke. Tonight, I wrote a new one. You did more than redraw. You replanted. You chose your soil, your sunlight, your season, and you bloomed. And this time, I signed it. Eleanor, heir of her own grace.